Okay, welcome everybody. We might get started. So welcome to this session of the conference. My name is Diane Hall from Victoria University, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session with Professor Robert Phiddian from Flinders University. He teaches in Renaissance and 18th century literature, and also with a special interest in political satire and humour. And he also has an interest in current Australian political cartoons. And he was just talking before about a book that he is preparing for a few years' time on Australian cartooning traditions. So that's something that I at least am very much looking forward to. So his talk today is on Smith's Weekly and the larrikin tradition in Australian cartooning. And so I might turn over the Zoom room to him. We will have time for some questions later on. So thank you very much, Robert.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Diane. And thank you for the warm welcome. So Smith's Weekly, so I'm going to give, it's a weekly newspaper that ran for 31 years nearly. I'm talking particularly about the cartoons. So there's a warning, there will be inappropriate images. We're diving into the white blokish Australia of the early 20th century, what it found funny. There's a lot I find not funny, some of it a bit offensive. So that's a general warning. I'm not going to keep making such qualifications all the time on the way through. And there you have images, a cartoon run in 1933 showing many of the regular cartoonists at Smith's Weekly. It continues on the next slide. So it's an indication of how central cartooning was to this 24-page paper that they had nearly a dozen regular cartoonists. I want to thank my colleagues Richard Scully and Stephanie Brooks and Lindsay Foyle, with whom I'm engaged on the history of Australian cartooning for Melbourne University Press. I've basically got the 20th century, so that's my focus. I also want to thank the State Library of New South Wales for the Ross Steele Fellowship, which is not getting me into the Mitchell Library near enough at present, but I hope to get there over the summer, even if the summer has to be defined very extensively. So larrikin is a complicated word, as this says. It's in academic circles. It remains a central term in the popular mind. Every time I talk, someone wants me to talk about Australian humour in the media, they want me to talk about larrikins. So I think we have to try and work out how to use it, how to relate to it. A little bit of prehistory, the evolution of the larrikin's humour is particularly a late 19th century term. So Melissa Ballanter in her Larrikins, a History traces it from the 1860s to the 1920s, where she thinks it's changed. And what has changed fundamentally at that point, I agree, is that in the earlier period, it's an aesthetic and a way of living for borderline criminal members of the poor urban working classes in Sydney, in her reference frame, Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. I don't know how much it ran in Adelaide. So she talked about this ending sort of around World War I, and I think, and that's really where I'm picking the story up, that the larrikin moves out of the inner suburbs and down the tram and train tracks to the more respectable suburbs, particularly amongst the returned soldiers. So other contributing factors are the complications of the bush legends associated with the bulletin from the 1890s, which is obviously what the quotation from Peter Kirkpatrick is there about, but particularly the significance of the returned men, as Barry Humphries at least used to call them. So what Kirkpatrick says about the bulletin, that ignored the early bulletin's own cosmopolitanism, I think is also the case with Smith. With larrikin, we also need terms like cosmopolitan, chauvinist, but also bohemian, bourgeois, and different versions of respectable and certainly of moralistic to explain the character of the paper, I guess I'm talking about at this stage, but particularly the character of the cartooning. So the Bertha Smith Weekly. This cartoon was in the first edition. I think it's hilarious. So it's 1919, of course, the Spanish flu. We don't have to wear masks here. I must keep 6 feet away, but I must keep 6 feet away from you. And she says, "Thank goodness." So you could run that cartoon. Could have run that cartoon any time last year and most of this year. So it's started at the 1st of March 1919, in the wake of World War I, in the shadow of the Bulletin, which was a more literary magazine. It was more a magazine, whereas Smith's was always a weekly newspaper. And at the dawn of the 20s, and its existence happened through 3 really distinctly different decades. Like much of media history, it's a very Sydney newspaper, but it did also have, it certainly had national distribution and indeed international distribution as far as a New Zealand edition. So there were technically separate state editions, which were in practice early editions of the final Sydney paper, with a little bit of local content. What do I mean by the larrikin tradition in cartooning? This cartoon by the returned serviceman Cecil Hart with Billy Hughes at Versailles, shooting up the joint with Foch, Woodrow Wilson, David Lloyd George Clemenceau, all sort of running away. Has a lot of the spirit of the cartooning. Smith himself, Joynton Smith, who funded it, was very keen on horse racing, and certainly there were a lot of horses in these cartoons. And so this is the image of Hughes as wild colonial boy at Versailles, whatever you think of how he actually worked. So the detail one, before we go on to the various different cartoonists, it's a populist journal, definitely. National in distribution with mildly modified state editions. The money was put up by Sir James Joynton Smith, who was Mayor of Sydney. He was a former publican. He owned racecourses. He was very significant in raising money during World War I for the war effort. The journalists involved in setting up were Claude Mackay and Clyde Packer. They were the initial editorial team. And the most persistent presence on the paper was Claude Mackay, who came in and out over time, but dominated the spirit of it. It was prosperous quickly and always marked by cartoonists. They were very well paid for the time, both the staff cartoonists and also some cartoons taken by individual contributors. It was a broadsheet for the first couple of decades of its life until World War II. Paper rationing brought it down in size to a tabloid format. Lots of cartoons. So in the fairly typical edition from 1933, I've managed to count 82 cartoons or caricatures. That's excluding the hand-drawn materials and advertisements, but not much else. By the 1940s, there's still as many as 50. In a 24-page paper, that means nearly every page has several cartoons of some kind or another on it. It travelled the Federation, I've said that really, and I know I've said it a couple of times, but it is very important that it attached its identity to the returned soldiers and to the sense that they had been hard done by. It focused also as much on city as on country life. I think it's very important in the transition of the myth of Australian masculinity from the country to the city, which of course has been demographically true for the whole time of the whole of settler Australian society. Even amongst journalists, the culture was hard drinking, and it expired rather suddenly in 1950. There's a fabulous book in the box in the State Library of New South Wales, which I found after a while I realised was what was left over at the end of the last day, including a bunch of cartoons that had been accepted but not in the end published. So what do the cartoons look like? Very much in the black and white tradition of Australian art. And I'll also run a couple of themes here. It was the champion of the diggers, that new category, which I think is an important, well, not me alone, I think is an important transition category for both the Bushmen and the townmen to come together in one version of white Australian masculinity. So that's Cecil Hart on the left, and he was one of the first cartoonists. He eventually committed suicide. And on the right is Frank Dunn, who took over particularly the digger cartoons after Hart. What are we fighting for? A place in the sun, which does seem to me still quite an amusing comment on the life in the trenches. I've asserted that it's more urban than rural. I realise I haven't done the quantitative work to demonstrate this yet. I'm not sure quite how one would do that without an awful lot of material support. But what do I mean by this? There's an awful lot of office cartoons like the one on the left by Jim Russell. They are overwhelmingly chauvinist, where women are involved, which is quite often, but as this one is. But there is still a continuation of the Dad and Dave, the Dad and Dave image, which is carried through most of the Australian black and white tradition in the late 19th, early 20th century, and that's an example on the right. Still with the 19th century larrikin sort of flared pants on Dave, it appears. Other topics that they were interested in, partly as a result of trying to do things for diggers, but also just out of a populist support for the little man. They were very interested in attacking bureaucracy. I think this George Blaikie cartoon is wonderfully mid-20th century weird, with those almost demonic bureaucrats spearing some poor guy to death with their pens. I'm less impressed by the Joe Johnson on the right, but there's an awful lot in the paper about divorce. Divorce seems to have been a relatively new thing. There was relatively more divorce, and it was always a topic of interest. So, and particularly the male cartoonists did rather take the chauvinist line. So that's just a very traditional mother-in-law joke by Johnson. There were, however, female cartoonists. And to be honest, about as many as there have ever been. When I started working on cartoons in the late 90s, I said, well, there aren't many female cartoonists, but the people with the gigs got their jobs in the 60s and 70s, and that was when only men got such jobs. But that'll sort itself out over time, and it hasn't. Cartooning is still an overwhelmingly male profession in Australia. With some very notable exceptions to that. So it's not a talent thing, of course it isn't. So that remains a problem, I think, for the Australian cartooning tradition that we'll have to address, particularly as we get on through the 20th century and into the 21st. But here's Molly Horseman and Joe Morrison. And these are a little bit more subversive, it seems to me. The men look goofier. And the women look rather elegant. So they were staff cartoonists, both of them, for a long time. And so the idea that it is yes, it is a male-dominated environment, but like I said, that's about as many female cartoonists as there have ever been. And the other version of feminine is associated with Virgil Riley, a sort of 20s flapper image, which I think is, well, I find very elegant anyway. I love this cartoon. What do we do? What are you doing this weekend? Oh, nothing to speak of. Oh, I thought you'd given up on that sort of thing. That one. So that brings in what I particularly want to add to the story is a sort of bohemian sophistication in what was a paper that was one up from truth in certain respects. How am I going for time? I'm still okay. I can just about get there. And there's a wonderful collaboration between Virgil Riley and Kenneth Slessor, who wrote for the paper and indeed edited it briefly in a couple of books called Darlinghurst Nights. And I find this is really quite elegant popular verse, but I think I might just skip on and rather than read some. But the reference to Villon and so on, this is not just warmed over Banjo Patterson by any means. The most famous of the cartoonists was Stan Cross. In the first person to write at length about Smith's Weekly was George Blaikie, who worked there for its second 2 decades. And he makes this obviously problematic statement. The purest vein of Australian humour developed by Smith was probably the Jackie type of gag, of which Stan Cross was the undisputed master. Stan not only devised the merriest abo jokes, never a cruel one from Stan, but presented them with an artistry that is still quite breathtaking. And I think you can see that this is beautiful work. And the question is the Aboriginal figure really the butt of this joke? Or is it the wowser? And I think there is at least something arguable, at least some of the time, that the approach to Aboriginals and indeed to Jewish people was not cruel by the standards of the time. And so that's one of the interpretive problems one has, of course, while writing media history, uses stereotypes that we would no longer be comfortable with. This is the most famous cartoon, Stop Laughing, which I have spent much of this year chasing around because for various reasons it was not actually reproduced in the Trove version of the July 29th paper. But we've written a whole paper on that, so if you're interested in this cartoon, I'm quite happy to send you a draft. It's a dominant myth, and also look at the way this is bringing an image of city life into a Sydney newspaper. There were really no buildings at all at that stage, but it does fit with the aesthetic. It's a moment of the Empire State Building, and it does fit with the aesthetic influence of the Harbour Bridge, which was being completed about then as well. Critical perspectives, those who hymned it in the late 20th century, Blaikie, it was critical, raspberry firing, fast punching, capable of smelling a sacred cow from afar off against the wind. That's still the version of Australian humour that you'll find hymned in the popular press. Vane Lindsay, still 102, still the senior student of Australian cartooning. Smith Weekly's humour never varied. Humour about sex, not sexy humour, drinking and drunks, soldier humour, horse racing humour, Dad and Dave rural humour, the new departure in Australian humour, the theme of divorce, indeed for its comic interesting for its comic cynicism. Sylvia Lawson, actually in the 1980s, that's the second edition, 2006. Masculine gags and smartness. Its editorial line was nationalist, truculent, heavily racist, and well to the right. And the rightness is the other interesting thing. That's very much the transition from the bulletin's radical era. The bulletin itself also undertook in this period, moving towards what's mentioned also in Sally Young's. The second bit there, proclaimed itself to be anti-party politics, but it too admired Hughes and hated communism. So I think there is some sense that Smith is permitting a move. Smith is permitting a move towards Menzian Australia. So Peter Fitzpatrick also talks about its larrikinism as a negative thing, a Philistine defensive posture, an affirmative national ideology, and also particularly the idea of myth-making. This is very much, it's consciously myth-making. And the image there, for what it's worth, £75. £75 for an accepted joke suggestion. Think about, they paid well. They paid their jokers and their cartoonists as well. So just to absolutely to finish off my final thoughts, and they're a bit miscellaneous still because I haven't written this, as you can tell, I haven't written this up as a narrative yet. I wonder how nationally definitive, so Sydney-based a newspaper can be, but I do think this bears on the increasing domination of Australian media by Sydney through the 20th century. The idea that the graphic humour is informed by that blokey white Australian larrikinism, but as well an internationalist bohemianism and a populist politics of respectability. And I haven't really talked about that, but it does seem to me that this is that there is a sort of movement towards a Menzian respectability that is available as a sort of counterbalance. And I still think I have to keep using this word larrikin, much though it's got its problems, to describe the Australian cartooning tradition. And Smith obviously cannot simply be celebrated, but it does engage in myths of nationhood and of how to be Australian that have real cultural and political consequences echoing today. So I'll call it quits at that point. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Robert. That was really interesting. Okay, we've got a few minutes for questions, if anybody has any. Great, thanks. That makes it much easier to see everybody. All right. Does anybody have any questions for Robert?
Can I ask a quick question for Robert? I'm just wondering whether Philip May ever drew for Smiths, and following up, May was only ever here for a couple of years, wasn't he, in Australia? Like, to what extent were the cartoonists who drew for Smiths, locally born versus, people who came in from overseas like May?
May was much earlier, so he was 1880s, and yes, he was here only for a couple of years. I think under 3 years at the Bulletin. So he was part of he's part of the very much of that earlier, more politically radical, still obviously racist version of Australian cartooning then. The cartoonists at Smiths were predominantly Australian born, which is a change from the Bulletin era before the 20th century, because not only May, he was English and returned to England, but Livingston Hopkins was American. He stayed, and he was the most continuous cartoonist there. And the Bulletin also in this era got Schofield from England, but Stan Cross was from Western Australia. Or he was born in the US, but he was back in Australia before he could speak. And some of them were migrants, but they were predominantly they were Australian-born cartoonists, because it is, after all, 20 years, 30 years later, and so there is a stronger media body for them to be in. Thank you.
Right, thanks. Anybody else?
Yeah, I had one, Rob. Oh, sorry, Michael, do you want to go?
No, you go first. Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you. Rob, I'm just Thank you for that presentation. It was really interesting. The thing that struck me, particularly in the sort of use of the term larrikin and how that is used today and continues to be used today in ways that you're alluding to. And I'm thinking of the series that ran on Sky News last year called The Death of the Aussie Larrikin. And it was about comedy, Australian comedy, and how, you know, it was being strangled by political correctness and so on. And the sort of words of Belich were kind of invoked in that cause. And as you would probably know, in recent years, there's been a couple of contentious cartoons that Belich produced that then were complained about largely unsuccessfully to the Press Council. And out of that has come this sort of, you know, there's this program saying political correctness is killing humour and so on. I'm just wondering to what extent the way those issues came up in Smith's Weekly's history are similar, and to what extent they're different to today, and the sort of where they're deployed as some kind of arm of the culture wars.
I think there was a very strong license to attack sacred cows. So what they wouldn't attack were definitely a different sort of things. It was very anti-authoritarian. So Smith's is probably more a predecessor of the approach in that Sky News thing. I got contacted once by someone writing for the Daily Telegraph wanting to talk about the death of Australian humour. And after I talked to her for a while, curiously, I didn't make it into the paper because I didn't say what they wanted. There's definitely a claiming of public space for a sort of, well, particularly for the diggers, but also for what they represented, an Australian masculinity. And so in that sense, there was a culture war going on, but it was treated as good humour. There was a lot to female bodies, so it was relatively sexually explicit for the era.
Yeah.
I think that's sometimes done well, sometimes done less well. But that sense that the larrikin said things loudly and raucously seems to have been accepted in this context, and not available. Well, one of the interesting things about cartooning is how long Australia hung on to weeklies as the main medium for cartoons. It seems to me the daily newspapers did have some cartooning through this period, particularly in Sydney, almost not at all in Melbourne and elsewhere. But the fact that it is a weekly allows a greater license for that. That the fact that it was independent, it was funded by Smith until it started making money. He lost quite a lot of money until then, according to the biographies. So that's a few sort of reads.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much, everybody. I think there's probably more questions, but unfortunately we've run out of time. I think our session is supposed to finish just on 12 so that you can all move on to another session. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Robert very much for the paper, and we really look forward to the book when it comes out. and good luck trying to get into those archives in New South Wales in the current conditions.
Thank you.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks very much, everybody, and for a really enjoyable session. That was great. Bye-bye.